June 22, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. The sun had not yet touched the border forests between occupied Poland and the Soviet Union when the sky began to tremble. First came the distant sounds, the deep roar of thousands of engines, the metallic rumble of tanks, the growing buzz of planes slicing through the air. In seconds, the silence of dawn was torn apart by explosions that seemed to rip the earth itself. It was the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. From that moment on, the non-aggression pact signed between Germany and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Hitler's empire broke its own oath, launching more than 4 million soldiers, 3,000 aircraft, and 600,000 vehicles against Soviet territory. It was the largest military movement ever seen, and, ironically, the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. But none of this was improvised. Hitler had been planning this attack for years. Since his time in prison in Mein Kampf, he saw the Soviet Union as the ultimate enemy, the obstacle between the German people and the racial empire he imagined dominating Eastern Europe. Ideology mixed with strategy. He despised communism, coveted the oil of the Caucasus, the wheat of Ukraine, and the vast minerals of the Urals. For him, conquering the East meant transforming Germany into the supreme power in the world. Meanwhile, Stalin believed peace could still last. The German-Soviet pact, signed in 1939, seemed to guarantee tranquility. But this confidence was fragile. The Red Army was weakened. In the previous years, Stalin had ordered the execution or imprisonment of 3/4 of his most experienced officers in political purges. Veteran generals vanished, and what remained was a disorganized, fearful, and hesitant military structure. Even so, the Soviet Union was still gigantic. More than 20,000 tanks, millions of soldiers, and an industry that stretched from Europe to Siberia. It was a colossus that, if given time to react, could become invincible. Hitler knew this, and that's why he struck first. Before crossing the Soviet border, however, he took care to secure the southern flank. In April 1941, his troops invaded the Balkans. In a few days, Yugoslavia fell. Athens was taken in less than 3 weeks despite British support. It was a spectacle of military efficiency, the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Each defeated country seemed to confirm that the German machine was invincible. When the last Greek soldier surrendered, the path to the east was open. Now 3 large German army groups prepared for the final blow. The northern group, commanded by von Lieb, would advance toward Leningrad. The central group, under von Bock, would march straight to Moscow, and the southern group, led by Rundstedt, would head for Ukraine, the agricultural heart of the Soviet Union. The generals themselves knew the plan was too ambitious, but no one dared challenge Hitler. In the first minutes of the attack, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, swept the Soviet sky. In a matter of hours, thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed still on the ground. By dawn, the tanks crossed the border. Columns of panzers advanced at brutal speed, leaving dust, smoke, and fear in their wake. In just 2 days, they had penetrated dozens of kilometers into Soviet territory. The Red Army's counteroffensives were quick but disorganized. Without coordination and poor communication, many units were surrounded and annihilated. Near Minsk, more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in a single operation. German air dominance was total. In the villages of Ukraine and Belarus, part of the population received the invaders as liberators, believing they were being saved from Stalin's oppressive regime. But in Moscow, the impact was devastating. When he received the news of the invasion, Stalin fell into absolute silence. Witnesses reported that he disappeared for days, unable to react to the betrayal he had refused to see. The man who ruled the USSR with an iron fist was paralyzed. It was only on July 3, almost 2 weeks later, that he reappeared in a radio broadcast speech calling on the people to fight for Mother Russia. On the same day, on the other side of Europe, Winston Churchill announced that any enemy of Hitler would henceforth be a friend of Great Britain. Thus was born an unlikely alliance between the British capitalist empire and the Soviet communist regime, united only by fear of a common enemy. In the following weeks, the Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. Tanks, infantry, aviation, everything moved in lethal synchrony. German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers in a few weeks. Entire cities fell one after another. Reports from Berlin spoke of crushing victories, mass captures, and complete destruction of enemy defenses. But among the Wehrmacht's own officers, unease was growing. The advance was too fast. Supply lines were stretching dangerously. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to cross destroyed roads and railways, incompatible with German tracks. The lightning success hid a silent trap. The deeper the army advanced, the more fragile it became. As the summer burned across the Russian plains, few realized that this victorious glow would be fleeting. Operation Barbarossa seemed like a perfect machine, but it was powered by wrong assumptions and by a leader convinced that will and ideology could replace reality. The clock of war marked only the beginning. Germany believed it was opening the path to world domination. In truth, it was marching toward its own collapse. July 1941. The heat of the European summer mixed with the dust kicked up by endless columns of tanks, trucks, and horses crossing the eastern plains. Hitler's map seemed to come alive. Each day of the Wehrmacht's advance meant dozens of cities captured, thousands of prisoners, and the reinforced belief that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. For the German soldiers, this was confirmation of everything they had heard. The war would be quick, decisive, a glorious repetition of what they had seen in France, only on a larger scale. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, seemed to work perfectly. On paper, the superiority seemed indisputable. Germany had more reliable tanks, more agile planes, and a military doctrine based on coordination, speed, and efficient communication. The Red Army, on contrast, seemed like a clumsy giant, trapped in the rigidity of plans and the confusion caused by Stalin's purges. But there was something the reports didn't show. Behind the numbers and initial victories, German logistics were beginning to wear thin. The advance was so swift that fuel trucks and supply trains couldn't keep up. Soviet railways used different gauges from the German ones. For every line captured, it was necessary to dismantle and reassemble tracks, delaying the arrival of ammunition and food. Even so, the generals maintained confidence. By mid-July, the forces of Guderian and Hoth had already reached Smolensk, just 400 kilometers from Moscow. The encirclement was brutal. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and surrendered. German newspapers celebrated the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. But in Moscow, something was changing. Stalin's initial paralysis gave way to total mobilization. Entire cities were called to war. Industries began to be dismantled and transported, piece by piece, beyond the Urals, out of reach of the Luftwaffe. Workers, peasants, women, and even children began producing ammunition, tanks, and planes under bombings. Soviet propaganda spoke of a great patriotic war.
Meanwhile, the German generals began to worry about time. Hitler's plan depended on a quick victory before winter arrived. Supplies were already at the limit, and vehicle wear was increasing. Even the feared panzer tanks were beginning to suffer from distance and difficult terrain. The Soviets, in turn, were still losing battles but learning from each defeat. Units began to adopt more flexible tactics, The T-34 tanks, which began to appear on the front, surprised the Germans. They had sloped armor that deflected shots, and a robust engine capable of crossing mud and snow. They were less sophisticated than German tanks, but much better adapted to Russian terrain. Even so, at that moment, the scale seemed to tip toward the German side. The advance continued on three fronts. In the north, von Lieb's army group encircled Leningrad, isolating the city. In the center, von Bock pressed toward Moscow. And in the south, von Rundstedt headed for Kiev, facing growing resistance. By mid-August, the offensive seemed unstoppable. Each Soviet encirclement seemed to repeat the same pattern, a trap that closed with mathematical precision, resulting in hundreds of thousands of prisoners. In the rear, columns of prisoners walked kilometers under the scorching sun, without food, without water. The size of the captures impressed even the Germans themselves. But it was in this moment of victory that the first major mistake emerged. Hitler, convinced that Moscow would fall easily, decided to intervene directly in military command. Instead of allowing the generals to maintain momentum toward the capital, he ordered the Central Group's tanks to turn south, toward Kiev. He believed that destroying the Soviet army in Ukraine would be more important than taking Moscow. The generals protested. Guderian, in particular, warned that the maneuver would cost precious time, but no one dared to challenge the Führer. Obedience was absolute. The decision divided the forces and broke the rhythm of the offensive. While part of the divisions headed for Kiev, the remaining units had to maintain pressure in the center. The advance toward the Soviet capital lost speed. In the south, the battle for Kiev became a colossal spectacle: encirclements, counterattacks, reversals. When it finally ended, the Germans had captured more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers, one of the greatest tactical victories of the war. Hitler celebrated the feat as proof of his strategic genius, but the lost time would not return. Moscow now had gained something no commander can buy: precious weeks to prepare. During this interval, the Red Army reorganized its lines, fortified the capital's defense, and received new reinforcements from the eastern regions. The cold was beginning to approach, and with it, the change of fate. In Germany, few realized it. The newspapers still spoke of triumph, but field officers knew something was wrong. The lightning war, which depended on surprise and speed, was becoming slow, heavy, and predictable. In the Soviet fields, the first autumn rains began to fall. The soil turned into thick mud, an invisible enemy that stalled engines, bogged down trucks, and turned roads into traps. What had begun as a triumphant march was beginning to become a test of endurance. And in the midst of this scenario, Hitler committed the gravest mistake of all, believing that the war was already won.
October 1941. The Russian sky was turning gray, and the wind blowing across the plains began to herald winter. The German columns, which months before crossed the fields with confidence and speed, now crawled over roads turned into thick mud. The Russian name for it was Rasputitsa, the season when the ground dissolves and war stops. The panzer tanks, symbols of lightning war, bogged down like toys. Trucks sunk up to their axles. Exhausted horses pulled heavy guns across terrain that seemed to suck in everything that moved. Fuel took days to arrive. The cold increased, and soldiers improvised clothing from blankets and rags. Even so, the order was clear: advance. Hitler demanded that Moscow be taken before winter arrived in full. The Soviet capital was the symbol, the political and psychological heart of resistance. Capturing it, he believed, would break Soviet morale and end the Eastern Campaign. But the Soviets thought differently. In Moscow, General Georgy Zhukov had taken command of the defense. Cold, methodical, and relentless, Zhukov turned the city into a fortress. Thousands of civilians dug trenches around the capital. Women, students, and the elderly carried sandbags, built barricades, and improvised anti-tank obstacles.
Buildings were camouflaged, factories redirected to weapon production, and church bells silenced to not guide enemy bombers. Meanwhile, the German divisions approached slowly. Each kilometer cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives. Soldiers marched with soaked feet, faces burned by the cold, and weapons jamming with ice. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the sky, began to lose strength with storms and near-zero visibility. In November, temperatures dropped below zero. Engines froze. Gun oil hardened. Leather boots cracked. Many German soldiers still wore light uniforms designed for summer campaigns. The command believed the war would have ended before winter, and there were no adequate clothes for the Russian cold. Gradually, the confidence of the Blitzkrieg faded. Front reports spoke of stalled tanks, lost supplies, and units isolated in the ice. The offensive that began with a roar now moved in silence. Even so, the Germans came dangerously close. In December, they were less than 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. With binoculars, they could see the city's towers covered in snow. But then something changed. In early December, Stalin received news that would change the course of the war. Intelligence services confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia. This freed up dozens of Soviet divisions stationed in the east, troops accustomed to fighting at 40 degrees below zero, dressed and equipped for extreme cold. These units began to arrive secretly in Moscow. They were disciplined, silent, and motivated soldiers. Many of them rode skis and used white camouflage. On December 5th, Zhukov launched his counterattack. The impact was devastating. The Germans, exhausted and frozen, were caught by surprise. Soviet troops advanced with speed, breaking lines at several points and pushing the invaders away from the capital. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. The shock was enormous. German propaganda, which until then spoke only of victories, now had to explain why soldiers were retreating. Hitler, furious, dismissed several generals and decided to take direct command of the Eastern Front. His new order was simple and cruel: no retreat, no step back. The officers knew this meant only one thing: freeze in place and die. But the machine obeyed. Units dug trenches in the ice and prepared to resist. It was the end of the Blitzkrieg. The concept of quick war, based on mobility and surprise, no longer made sense. Now began a war of resistance, of attrition, a war Germany was not prepared to fight. While Moscow resisted, Hitler watched his dream of quick conquest turn into a nightmare. The advance that should have lasted weeks stretched into years. The offensive that should have guaranteed resources and living space turned into a bottomless pit, draining men, fuel, and hope. And the winter, relentless, seemed to fight alongside the Soviets. In Berlin, industry officers tried to explain the impossible. Production and supply calculations simply didn't add up. For every tank lost in the east, it would take 2 months of work to replace. For every plane shot down, parts and aluminum were lacking. Germany, which had bet on winning through speed, now faced its own industrial limit.
If you've made it this far, you've already realized that the fall of the Blitzkrieg wasn't just because of the cold. It was the moment when Hitler's empire began to crack from within. If you like real stories told with depth and rhythm, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. The next parts will show how every mistake, every choice, and every number sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The winter of 1941-1942 marked the turning point. The Wehrmacht lost more than 700,000 men between dead, wounded, and missing. The German lines, once fluid and fast, literally froze. On the other side, the Red Army not only survived, it learned, adapted, and grew. From then on, Germany would never regain the initiative. But Hitler still wouldn't accept it.
In 1942, he decided to change strategy. Instead of attacking Moscow, he would focus on the south, seeking the Caucasus oil fields and control of a city that, for him, carried a name too symbolic to ignore: Stalingrad. And it was that decision that would turn defeat into tragedy. The winter of 1941 had passed, but the scars of defeat before Moscow remained open. The German generals, accustomed to quick victories, now faced a reality they had never imagined: a long war of attrition and without clear borders. The Wehrmacht, which had entered the Soviet Union as an invincible machine, now suffered from a lack of men, fuel, and morale. Even so, Hitler wouldn't accept retreat. He believed the defeat before Moscow was just a temporary stumble, and that after the arrival of spring, Germany would regain the initiative. But this time, the plan would be different. Instead of attacking the center, where Soviet defenses were strengthening, he decided to shift focus to the south. There were the Caucasus oil fields, vital to fuel the Reich's industries and tanks. And on the way to that region, there was a city that carried a name too symbolic to ignore: Stalingrad. Hitler saw in that city not just a strategic point, but a personal matter. Conquering the city that bore Stalin's name would be a political and psychological victory. It was a chance to erase the humiliation of Moscow and prove to the world and to himself that he was still in control of destiny. Thus was born Operation Blue, Fall Blau, launched in June 1942. This time, the German forces were better equipped. The Panzer divisions had been resupplied, the Luftwaffe had regained some strength, and new Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian units were incorporated into the effort. But the problem remained the same. Hitler's empire tried to fight on fronts too large, with resources too small. At the beginning, the offensive seemed to work. The German army advanced through Ukraine with the same speed as the first months of Barbarossa. Cities fell, oil fields were taken, and Soviet columns retreated in disorder. The old sense of invincibility returned. But there was something different this time. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had already learned to predict the German style of attack. Instead of trying to hold the line, the Soviets retreated slowly, sacrificing territory in exchange for time. Every kilometer yielded delayed German logistics and stretched supply routes even further. Guderian's tanks, once symbols of mobility, now depended on fuel lines stretching hundreds of kilometers. The captured oil was insufficient. The army was divided. Part advanced toward the Caucasus, another part to the north, toward Stalingrad. The dispersion would be fatal. As German troops advanced, the city of Stalingrad began to prepare for the siege. The civilian population was called to dig trenches and set up barricades. General Vasily Chuikov, appointed by Zhukov to command the defense, received a simple order: defend the city or die trying. In early September 1942, the Luftwaffe began a massive bombardment. The sky over Stalingrad became an inferno of smoke and debris. In 2 days, entire neighborhoods disappeared. The ruins, however, did not break Soviet resistance. On the contrary, they transformed the city into a deadly labyrinth, ideal for urban combat. When German forces entered, they discovered that every street, every building, every basement would become a battle. Hand-to-hand combat was brutal. Control of the city changed hands several times a day. Reports described fighting inside factories, staircases, tunnels, even in the sewers. The Red Army, cornered, fought literally with whatever they had: improvised grenades, bayonets, even pieces of iron. But what the Germans didn't know was that outside the city, the Red Army was preparing a much larger move. Zhukov, now coordinating the entire Eastern Front, planned a major encirclement maneuver. While Hitler's forces concentrated everything inside Stalingrad, the Soviets amassed troops on the flanks, especially in positions defended by Germany's allied armies, like Romanians and Italians, less equipped and poorly prepared for the approaching winter. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began. The Soviet counterattack hit the tips of the German army with unexpected force. In a matter of days, the encirclement closed. Inside Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was completely isolated. More than 250,000 men trapped in a trap. When he received the news, Hitler was furious, but instead of authorizing a retreat, he gave an impossible order. Stalingrad must be defended to the last man. Marshal Hermann Göring promised that the Luftwaffe would resupply the army by air. It was an unrealistic promise. Calculations showed that 700 tons of supplies per day would be needed. The planes managed to deliver less than 100. Every flight was a battle against the cold, wind, and anti-aircraft fire. Winter returned, even harsher than the previous one. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. German soldiers ran out of fuel, ammunition, food. Hunger and freezing did what the enemy could not. Inside the city, men shared the last piece of bread and awaited the inevitable. If you've made it this far, you know we're approaching the breaking point. Europe's most powerful army is surrounded, and the fate of the war is about to change. If you like understanding how every decision shaped the outcome of World War II, subscribe now so you don't miss the final part of this story when the defeat at Stalingrad seals the definitive collapse of the Blitzkrieg.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin watched calmly. He knew that this victory would be more than military. It would be moral, political, and symbolic. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered, the world would see that the myth of German invincibility was over. And that's exactly what happened. On February 2, 1943, General Paulus surrendered. Of the more than 250,000 men encircled, only 90,000 survived to captivity, and fewer than 6,000 would return to Germany after the war. The defeat at Stalingrad was not just a tactical loss. It was the point at which the Third Reich began to fall. February 1943. The silence in Stalingrad was almost absolute. The snow-covered ruins hid what remained of the army that once believed itself invincible. Of the thousands who had besieged the city months before, only a handful still breathed, and among them General Friedrich Paulus, now a prisoner. When the surrender was officialized, Hitler refused to believe it. He called the act treason, cowardice. But in truth, what had collapsed there was not just an army, it was an idea. The idea that the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, could defeat any enemy, in any terrain, under any condition. After Stalingrad, the war in the East was never the same. The Wehrmacht lost the initiative forever. The Soviet Union, which had begun 1941 in collapse, now marched with growing confidence. In the following months, Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Urals, began producing on a scale no European country could match. More than 1,300 T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines every month. Planes, artillery, ammunition, everything was produced in absurd quantities. Meanwhile, Germany struggled to replace what it had lost. Raw materials, fuel, steel were lacking, and above all, time. From 1943 onward, the equation of the war became clear, cold, and irrefutable. Germany could no longer win. It could only delay the inevitable. In July of that same year, Hitler tried one last gambit, the Kursk offensive, the largest tank battle in history. It was a desperate attempt to regain the advantage, using the new Panther and Tiger models. But the Red Army, informed and prepared, turned the field into a colossal trap. More than 6,000 tanks clashed. When the dust settled, Germany had lost not only vehicles, but hope. The Blitzkrieg, the formula that had conquered half of Europe, was dead. Its basic principle, quick and decisive war, simply no longer worked. The Soviet Union had shown it could lose battles and still win the war. Hitler, on the other hand, proved he could win battles and still march toward defeat. Inside Germany, the collapse was visible. The economy was overburdened. Industries worked day and night,
but every month the deficit grew. The numbers were merciless. While the Soviets produced 5 tanks for every German one, the Luftwaffe lost planes faster than it could replace them. Allied air power in the west and the Soviet advance in the east crushed the Reich in a total economic siege. It was the mathematical end of the war, the tragedy of ignored calculations. In 1941, German engineers had predicted Germany could not sustain a long war against an industrially superior enemy. But Hitler ignored the data. He believed that will and faith could replace steel and fuel. And so the war, which began as a bolt of lightning, ended in exhaustion. In the last months of 1944, the Red Army crossed the Dnieper and marched toward Poland. The Eastern Front, which had once stretched thousands of kilometers deep into Russia, now advanced in reverse, straight toward Berlin. German cities burned under daily bombings. The country that had brought fire to the continent now received it back. Meanwhile, Hitler, isolated in his bunker, continued to give impossible orders. He sent non-existent armies against imaginary enemies. He believed in miracles that never came. Operation Barbarossa, which should have guaranteed eternal glory, became the ultimate symbol of ruin. In April 1945, Soviet tanks encircled the Reich's capital. The streets of Berlin, covered in debris, were the final echo of the same Blitzkrieg that 4 years earlier had roared victorious over Europe's plains. Now the thunder was different, the sound of Soviet cannons opening the way to the heart of Germany. On April 30, silence returned to the bunker, and with it, the end of the empire that believed itself eternal. After the war, when the archives were opened and the numbers were revealed, the calculations showed exactly what some German engineers and strategists had warned even before the invasion. Germany never had enough fuel, nor enough industries, nor logistics capable of sustaining a 3-front war. Victory was impossible, mathematically impossible, from the first day of Operation Barbarossa. What history showed was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of an illusion. The dream of total domination that began with a lightning invasion ended in ruins and silence. If you've made it this far, you've just traversed the entire journey of Operation Barbarossa, from the promise of conquest to the inevitable collapse. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of how arrogance, contempt for facts, and obsession with power condemned an entire empire. If you like real stories told with precision and engaging rhythm, subscribe to the channel. Here, every episode reveals not only what happened, but why it happened. Because history, when told with truth and context, is the best way to understand the present. And so, in the end, everything returns to the beginning. It all began with a silent morning at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, when thousands of engines awoke on the Soviet border. It seemed like the sound of victory, but in truth, it was the sound of the fall beginning.